Raid on Grand Pre. Here we have another image of Colonel Benjamin Church, who is also known as the father of American Rangers. The date was from 24th to 26th June 1704, and it was at Grand Pre, Acadia, which is present in present-day Nova Scotia. It was an English and Allied victory. The raid on Grand Pre was the major action of a raiding expedition conducted by the New England militia Colonel Benjamin Church against French Acadia in June 1704 during Queen Anne's War. The expedition was allegedly in retaliation for a French and Indian raid against the Massachusetts frontier community of Deerfield earlier that year. Departing Boston on 25th May 1704 with 500 provincial militia and some Indian allies, the expedition reached the Minas Basin on 24th June after raiding smaller settlements at Penobscot Bay and Passamaquoddy Bay. Although he lost surprise due to the famously high tides of the Bay of Fundy, Church quickly gained control of Grand Pre and spent 3 days destroying the town and attempting to destroy the dikes and levees that protected its croplands. The croplands were flooded by salt water, but the local Acadians quickly repaired the dikes and the raiders after the raiders left, and the land was returned to production. Church continued his raiding expedition, striking at Beaubassin and other communities before finally returning to Boston in late July. Context. When the War of the Spanish Succession, also called Queen Anne's War, widened to include England in 1702, it spawned conflict between the colonies of England and France in North America. Joseph Dudley, the governor of the English province of Massachusetts Bay, which then included present-day Maine, sought in June 1703 to ensure the neutrality of the Abenakis, who occupied the frontier between the Massachusetts and New France. In this, he was unsuccessful because New France's governor, Philip de Rigaud-Vaudreuil, knowing he would have to rely on Indian support for defense against the more numerous English, had already encouraged the Indians to take up the hatchet. Following the Wabanaki Confederacy of Acadia military campaign against the New England frontier, during the summer of 1703, the English colonists embarked on largely unsuccessful retaliatory raids against Abenaki villages. This prompted the Abenakis to participate in a raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts, under the under French leadership in February 1704. The severity of this raid, more than 50 villagers killed and more than 100 captured, prompted calls for revenge, and the veteran Indian fighter Benjamin Church offered his services for an expedition against the French colony of Acadia, which is roughly present-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and eastern Maine. Acadia was at the time dominated by a series of settlements dotting the shores of the Bay of Fundy and its adjacent bays. Its principal settlement and capital, Port Royal, was the only significantly fortified community, defended by a star fort with a modest garrison. The land at the top of the bay, on the shores of the Minas and Cumberland basins, was one of the major seats of food production in the colony, and Grand Pre was one of the largest and most successful communities on the Minas Basin, with a population of about 500 in 1701. French settlers to the area had brought with them knowledge on the constructions of dikes and levees, which they used to drain marshlands for agriculture and to protect those lands from the inflow of the exceptionally high tides, over 6 meters or 20 feet in some places, for which the Bay of Fundy is well known. The community of Beaubassin was the largest of several towns situated on the Isthmus of Chignecto and elsewhere on the shores of the Cumberland Basin. The start of the expedition. Grand Pre was raided in retaliation for the raid on Deerfield, which is depicted here. Church had previously led expeditions against Acadia during King William's War, and Governor Dudley issued him a colonel's commission for the effort, giving him specific orders to obtain Acadian prisoners that could be exchanged for the English prisoners taken in the Deerfield raid. The expedition was also to be one of punishment. You use all possible methods for the burning and destroying of the enemy's houses and breaking the dams of their corn grounds, and make what other spoil you can upon them, were his orders. Dudley, however, specifically denied Church permission to attack Port Royal, the Acadian capital, citing the need to get permission from London before taking such a step. The force Church raised consisted of about 500 volunteers from coastal areas of Massachusetts, including some Indians. He left Boston on 15 of 26 May with 14 transports and 3 warships. The warships include the Royal Navy vessels HMS Adventure, HMS Jersey of 42 guns, and HMS Gosport of 32 guns, which were also accompanied by the Massachusetts Ketch Province Galley under Cyprian Southac's command. Church took a former prisoner of the Maliseet, John Giles, as his translator. The expedition first sailed for Mount Desert Island. Near the entrance to Penobscot Bay. Church sent a force to raid Pentagouet, which is present-day Castine, Maine, where the Frenchman Baron Saint Castine had a fortified trading post. Saint Castine was absent, but Church took prisoner his daughter and her children. We also learned that a new French settlement was being built at Passamaquoddy Bay, so the expedition next sailed for that destination. Church sent a small force ashore near present-day St. Stephen, here now, New Brunswick, where they destroyed a house and raided a nearby Maliseet encampment, killing 1 Indian. Church then separated the warships, sending them to blockade the Digby Gut. The Digby Gut is the space between the lands leading into the Annapolis Basin, in the hopes of capturing French supply ship, while the bulk of his expedition sailed for Grand Pre. The 3 ship captains on 24th June demanded the surrender of the garrison at Port Royal, threatening a frontal assault with 1,700 New Englanders and sauvages, savages, meaning the native people. Governor Jacques-François de Montbaton de Broyan, despite defenses in poor conditions and a garrison of only 150 able men, saw through the bluff and refused. Historian George Horlick speculates that Governor Dudley may have intentionally asked them to make this bluff without Church's involvement. Here's the detail from an 18th century map showing the English expedition's movements up to its arrival at Grand Pre and Port Royal. Here to here, here's to Digby Gut and Port Royal, and here's to Grand Pre. The principal detailed account of these events was provided by Colonel Church in his memoirs, first published in 1716. French military officers later summarized the damage caused by the raiders. Day 1, the arrival. On 24th June to 3rd July 1704, Church arrived at Grand Pre on the frigate Adventure. Hoping to take advantage of the element of surprise, Church secretly approached the village from behind the heavily wooded Boot Island. Here's another image of the raid on Grand Pre. Having withdrawn from the village the next morning, the Acadian and Mi'kmaq militia waited in the woods for Church and his men to arrive. At the break of day, the New Englanders again set off towards the village, under orders from Church to drive away any resistance before them. The largest body of defenders fired on the raiders' right flank from behind trees and logs, but their fire was ineffective, and they were driven off. The raiders then entered the village and began plundering. Some of the men broke into the liquor stores they found and began drinking, but Colonel Church quickly put a stop to that activity. They spent the rest of the day destroying much of the village. According to one of Church's dispatches, they destroyed 60 houses, 6 mills, and many barns, along with about 70 cattle. At one point, some of the men noticed that some of the Acadians were nearby, driving off some of their cattle. Church detached Lieutenant Barker and some men to give chase, warning them to advance with care. However, Barker was somewhat rash in pursuing the chase, and he and another man were killed before the raiders retreated back to the village. That evening, the raiders built a fortification out of logs while burning the church and the rest of the village. Church reported that the whole town seemed to be on fire all at once. All but one home was burned. Day 3, Destruction of the Harvest. On the morning of the third day, Church gave the orders to destroy the dikes and, in turn, all the crops. 7 dikes were broken, destroying most of the harvest and ruining over 200 hogsheads of stored wheat. A hogshead is a big bag of wheat. To give the impression to the Acadians and Mi'kmaq that his forces were leaving, Church had his soldiers burn the fortifications that they had built the day before. He also had them load themselves and the whaleboats back onto their transport vessels. Some of the Acadians returned in the night and immediately began to mend the broken dikes. However, Church had anticipated this and sent men back to the town to drive the Acadians off. Here again is a detail from an 18th century map annotated to show the English expedition's movements after the raid. So here they went on to Pisiquid, which is now where Fort Beausejour is, and the Nova Scotia New Brunswick border, and then returning back to New England. End of the expedition. This is Governor of Massachusetts, Joseph Dudley. This is the flag that Colonel Church and his troops were flying. The next day, Church left Grand Pre and went on to raid Pisiquid, as we saw in the previous map. Present-day Windsor and Falmouth, Nova Scotia, not far from Grand Pre, where he took 45 prisoners. He then sailed to Port Royal to rejoin the fleet blockading Port Royal. According to uncorroborated French reports, the blockaders had made some landings in the vicinity of Port Royal, burning a few isolated houses and taking some prisoners. Governor Brouillan organized defenses that successfully prevented further landings. After rejoining the warships, Church had held a council to discuss whether or not to launch a large-scale attack against Port Royal. The council decided that their force was inferior to the strength of the enemy and that they would quit it, Port Royal, wholly, and go about their other business. The expedition then sailed back up the Bay of Fundy to Chignecto, up here, where the village of Beaubassin was raided. Beaubassin is not far away from where eventually Fort Beausejour is built. Its inhabitants had by then been alerted to the English activities, and under the leadership of Father Claude Trouvé, had removed their possessions and as much livestock as possible from the village to Chedabucto, which is Guysborough, Nova Scotia. Church, after some ineffectual skirmishing with villagers hiding in the woods, burned the village's houses and barns and slaughtered 100 head of cattle before sailing for Boston. Church reported that 6 of his men were killed over the course of the expedition. The aftermath. The prisoners that Church took were brought to Boston, where they were at first given relatively free access to the town. The town selectman complained, and the Acadians were then confined to Castle William. They were exchanged in 1705 and 1706 for prisoners taken in the Deerfield raid, although the negotiations were complicated by Dudley's initial refusal to release the noted French privateer Pierre Maisonneuve de Baptiste, who was ultimately exchanged along with Noel Doiron and other captives for Deerfield's minister, John Williams. The direct effects of the raid were fairly short-lived. Because of the destruction of the crop and stored grain, the colony suffered a flour shortage that winter, although it was not severe enough to cause significant hardship. Grand Pre was rebuilt, the dikes were repaired, and there was a successful harvest in 1706. The memory of the raid, however, lasted in the population. As late as the 1740s, after Acadia had become British Nova Scotia, Grand Pre's inhabitants worried about a return of English raiders and were cautious in their dealing with British authorities. Dudley's decision to deny Church permission to attack Port Royal had political ramifications. His opponents in Massachusetts accused him of protecting Port Royal because he was benefiting from illicit trade with Acadia. These allegations continued for several years, and Dudley eventually chose to deal with them by launching the failed attacks on Port Royal in 1707. Siege of Port Royal, 1707. The first siege, from 6th to 17th June 1707, and the second siege, 22nd August to 1st September 1707. Here is a map of Port Royal in 1702. The siege of Port Royal consisted of two separate attempts in 1707 by the British New England colonies to conquer the French colony of Acadia by capturing its capital of Port Royal during Queen Anne's War. Both attempts were made by colonial troops and were led by officers inexperienced in siege warfare. Led by Governor of Acadia, Daniel d'Alger de Subercase, this guy, the French garrison at Port Royal easily withstood both attempts, assisted by Acadian militia and the Wabanaki Confederacy outside the fort. The first siege began on June 6, 1707, and lasted 11 days. Provincial troops led by Colonel John March were able to establish positions near Port Royal's fort, but March's engineer claimed the necessary cannons could not be landed, and the British force withdrew amid disagreements in their war council. The second siege began August 22nd and was never able to establish secure camps owing to spirited defensive sorties organized by Subercase. Both siege attempts were viewed as a debacle in Boston, and the expedition's leaders were jeered upon their return. Ha ha! Subercase, concerned that the British might return the following year, strengthened the fortifications at Port Royal and incited attacks on New England merchant shipping. Port Royal was captured in 1710 by a larger force that included British Army troops, which marked the end of French rule in Acadia. Siege of Port Royal, 1710. This is a portrait believed to be of Francis Nicholson by Michael Dial in 1710. This is Nicholson. Siege of Port Royal in 1710 was from 5th to 13th October 1710. And on the British side were both British and New Englanders and Iroquois. And on the French side were the Acadians, the Wabanaki Confederacy, Mi'kmaq, and Abenaki. So it was a lot of natives fighting natives. Commanders were Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch, on the English side, and on the French side was Subercase and Pierre Saint Pierre Denis de Bonaventure. The strength on the British side was about 2,000 regular and provincial soldiers, and on the other side were fewer than 300 soldiers. But that doesn't count how many Acadian and Mi'kmaq troops were also there. The Siege of Port Royal from 5th to 13th October 1710, also known as the Conquest of Acadia, was a military siege conducted by British regular and provincial forces under the command of Francis Nicholson against a French Acadian garrison and the Wabanaki Confederacy under the command of Daniel d'Alger de Subercase at the Acadian capital, Port Royal. The successful British siege marked the beginning of permanent British control over the peninsular portion of Acadia, which had been referred to as Nova Scotia by the British since 1621. It was the first time the British permanently took and held a French colonial possession. After the French commander, the British occupied the fort in the capital with all the pomp and ceremony of having captured one of the great fortresses of Europe and renamed it Annapolis Royal. The siege was the third British attempt during Queen Anne's War to capture the Acadian capital, and it had profound consequences over the next 50 years. The conquest was a key element in the framing of the North American issues in French-British treaty negotiations of 1711 to 1713. It resulted in the creation of a new colony, Nova Scotia, and introduced significant questions concerning the fate of both the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq, who continued to occupy Acadia. The conquest of Acadia was a foundational moment in the history of the Canadian state. It was a precursor to the British conquest of New France in the middle of the century. Background: Port Royal was the capital of the French colony of Acadia, almost since the French first began settling the area in 1604. It consequently became a focal point for conflict between the English and French colonists in the next century. It was destroyed in 1613 by English raiders led by Samuel Argall, but eventually rebuilt. In 1690, it was captured by forces from the province of Massachusetts Bay, although it was restored to France by the Treaty of Ryswick. Early expeditions. With the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1702, colonists on both sides again prepared for conflict. Acadia's governor, Jacques-François de Montauban de Bouillon, had, in anticipation of war, already begun construction of a stone and earth fort in 1701, which was largely completed by 1704. Following a French raid on Deerfield on the Massachusetts frontier in February 1704, the English in Boston organized a raid against Acadia the following May, led by Benjamin Church. They raided Grand Pre and other Acadian communities. English and French accounts differ on whether Church's expedition mounted an attack on Port Royal. Church's account indicates that they anchored in the harbor and considered making an attack, but ultimately decided against the idea. French accounts claim that a minor attack was made. When Daniel d'Alger de Subercase became governor of Acadia in 1706, he went on the offensive, encouraging Aboriginal raids against English targets in New England. He also encouraged privateering from Port Royal against English colonial shipping. The privateers were highly effective. The English fishing fleet on the Grand Banks was reduced by 80% between 1702 and 1707, and some English coastal communities were raided. English merchants in Boston had long traded with Port Royal, and some of this activity had continued illegally after the war began. However, the business was being hurt by the war, and some merchants began making vocal calls for action, and public outrage rose over the failure of the Massachusetts defenses to stop the French and Aboriginal raids. Massachusetts Bay Governor Joseph Dudley had made repeated requests to London for support without any success, and finally decided to act independently to fend off accusations of complicity in the illegal trade. In spring of 1707, he authorized an expedition against Port Royal. This expedition made two separate attempts to take Port Royal, and for a variety of reasons, both attempts failed, despite the expedition's significant numerical superiority, which meant that the leaders were ridiculed later. British expedition organized. Here is an annotated detail from a 1713 map showing eastern New England and the southern Nova Scotia, Acadia. Port Royal is at A. Boston at B. And Casco Bay at C. Look carefully at the map and you'll see that map making was not necessarily so accurate at this time. In the following years, France failed to send any significant support, while the British mobilized larger and better organized forces for the conflict in North America. Samuel Vetch, a Scots businessman with colonial ties, went to London in 1708 and lobbied Queen Anne for military support to conquer all of New France. She authorized a great enterprise to conquer all of Acadia and Canada in 1709 that was aborted when the promised military support failed to materialize. Vetch and Francis Nicholson, an Englishman who had previously served as colonial governor of Maryland and Virginia, returned to England in its aftermath and again appealed to the Queen for support. They were accompanied by 4 Aboriginal chiefs who caused a sensation in London. Nicholson and Vetch successfully argued on behalf of colonial interests for British military support against Port Royal. Nicholson arrived in Boston on 15th July 1710, bearing a commission from the Queen as General and Commander-in-Chief of all and sundry the forces, to be employed in the expedition designed for the reducing of Port Royal in Nova Scotia. In addition to 400 Marines brought over from England, 4 New England provinces raised militia regiments. Massachusetts Bay provided 900, Rhode Island 180, Connecticut 300, and New Hampshire 100. Some of the provincial troops were drilled in the arts of siege warfare by Paul Mascarene, a Huguenot officer in the British Army. Huguenots were French Protestants. A band of Iroquois was also recruited to serve as scouts on the expedition. When the fleet sailed on 29 September, it consisted of 36 transports, 2 bomb galleys, and 5 warships. 2 ships, HMS Falmouth and HMS Dragon, were sent from England, while HMS Faversham and HMS Lowestoft were sent from New York to join with HMS Chester, which was already stationed at Boston. Nicholson sent HMS Chester ahead of the fleet to blockade the Digby Gut, which controlled naval access to Port Royal. Digby Gut. Here is the Annapolis River as it comes out here. Here is where the fort was. And Digby Gut, once again, is a tiny little gap of water between the two landforms that form the Annapolis Basin. This, in general, is the military engineer's drawing of Port Royal in 1702. Port Royal was defended by about 300 troops, many of whom were poorly trained recruits from France. Subercase had taken steps to improve their local defenses since the 1707 sieges, building a new bomb-proof powder magazine and barracks in 1708, and clearing woods from the riverbanks to deny attackers cover. He completed the construction of another vessel to assist in naval defense and engaged privateers with great success against New England fishing and shipping. From prisoners taken by the privateers, he learned that plans were continually being made in 1708 and 1709 for new attempts on Port Royal. The siege. As the fleet sailed north, it was met by a dispatch vessel sent by Thomas Matthews, captain of the Chester. She carried deserters from the French garrison, who reported that the morale was extremely low. Nicholson sent the ship ahead with one of the transports. When they entered Digby Gut, they received some fire from parties of Mi'kmaq on the shore. The ships returned fire with their cannons, without either side taking casualties. On 5th October, the main British fleet arrived at Goat Island, about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles below Port Royal. That afternoon, the transport Caesar ran aground while attempting to enter the Annapolis River and was eventually swept onto the rocks. Its captain, some of its crew, and 23 soldiers died, while a company commander and some 25 others struggled ashore. The following day, 6 October, British Marines began landing both north and south of the fortress and the town. The northern force was joined by 4 New England regiments under Colonel Vetch, while Nicholson led the remaining New England troops as part of the southern force. The landings took place without incident, with fire from the fort answered by one of the fleet's bomb ships at long range. Although later accounts of the siege claimed Vetch's detachment was part of a strategic plan to surround the fort, contemporary accounts report that Vetch wanted to have a command that was somewhat independent of Nicholson. These same accounts claim Vetch never got to within range of the fort's guns until the siege ended. His attempts to erect a battery of mortars in a muddy area across Alains Creek from the fort was repulsed by cannon fire. The southern force met with guerrilla-style resistance outside the fort, with Acadian and Aboriginal defenders firing small arms from houses and wooded areas. In addition to taking fire from the fort, this fire resulted in 3 British killed, but the defenders were unable to keep the British on the south side from establishing a camp about 400 yards, 370 meters from the fort. Here, again, is a picture of the magazine and one of the British, or a few of the British ships in the harbor. Over the next 4 days, the British landed their cannons and brought them up to the camp. Fire from the fort and supporters outside it persisted, and the British bomb ships wrought havoc within the fort. Here are the bomb ships, and with their fire each night. With the opening of a new British batteries imminent, Subercase sent out an officer with a parley flag on 10th October. The negotiations got off to a bad start because the officer was not properly announced by a drummer and deteriorated from there. Each side ended up holding an officer of the other, principally over matters of military etiquette, and the British continued their siege work. By 12th October, the siege trenches had advanced, and cannons that were within 300 feet, 91 meters, of the fort opened fire. Nicholson sent Subercase a demand that he surrender, and negotiations began once more. By the end of the day, the parties reached an agreement on the terms of surrender, which was formally signed the next day. The garrison was allowed to leave the fort with all the honors of war, their arms and baggage, drums beating, and colors flying. The British were to transport the garrison to France, and there were terms called for, and their terms, specific protections in the capitulation to protect the local residents. These terms called for the inhabitants within cannon shot of the fort to be allowed to remain on their properties for up to 2 years if they so chose, provided they were willing to take an oath to the British Crown. Aftermath. Here is an image of the evacuation of Port Royal, 1710, by C.W. Jeffreys. Here the French soldiers are marching out with the drummer drumming and British and colonial troops on either side watching them leave. The British took formal possession of Port Royal following a ceremony on 18th October, in which they renamed the place Annapolis Royal in honor of their queen. Samuel Vetch was inaugurated as the new governor of Nova Scotia. Massachusetts and New Hampshire proclaimed a day of public thanksgiving. This is Samuel Vetch, who became the first governor of Nova Scotia. The first French attempt to retake Annapolis Royal happened the next year after a skirmish in which a party of British soldiers was ambushed. Bernard Anselme d'Abbadie de Saint-Castine led a force of 200 Acadians and native warriors in a siege of the fort, without success. The capture of Port Royal marked the end of French rule in peninsular Acadia and inaugurated a struggle for control of the territory that lasted until the British conquests of the 7 Years' War. The status of Acadia was one of the more contentious issues in the negotiations leading to the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. Now remember, once again, the Acadians were active and very aggressive militants during the conflicts between 1710 and 1755, and very nearly the negotiations in the Treaty of Utrecht over this area very nearly led to renewed war. French negotiators were unable to recover Acadia, although they were able to retain Ile Saint-Jean, which is present-day Prince Edward Island, and Ile Royale, which is present-day Cape Breton Island, which provided access to the important Atlantic fisheries. Acadia's people were placed in a difficult position by the conquest. The British on numerous occasions demanded they take oaths to the British crown, but many refused to take oaths, requiring them to take arms against the French, preferring to proclaim their neutrality. For this and other reasons, hundreds of Acadians left peninsular Nova Scotia over the next decade. Most of them avoided the principal French colonial settlements and went to French-occupied Ile Saint-Jean, which is, once again, Prince Edward Island. Acadia's border was not formally demarcated by the Treaty of Utrecht, which became a cause of ongoing friction between the British and French, especially on the Isthmus of Chignecto, which is now the area border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which both sides eventually fortified. The French interpreted the phrase ancienne banderie, ancient boundaries, to imply only the peninsula of present-day Nova Scotia, thereby excluding the mainland between New England and the St. Lawrence, Ile Saint-Jean, and Cape Breton. This helped the Aboriginal groups of Abenaki, Malicites, and Mi'kmaq to retain their sovereignty over their old hunting grounds. The native population on the British side around this time was also expanding. Here is the Iroquois expansion in 1710. By the mid-18th century, the Iroquois Confederacy had expanded from upstate New York to the Ohio country. So this was the native force that opposed the Mi'kmaq and Malecite. In 1746, the Grand Expedition was organized in France under the command of the Duc d'Anville. The expedition was composed of 20 warships, 21 frigates, and 32 transport ships, containing 800 cannons, 3,000 soldiers, and 10,000 marines. The expedition was to retake Louisbourg and then Annapolis Royal. However, after a 3-month crossing and the dispersal of the fleet between Sable Island and the mainland, the expedition turned out to be a disaster for the French, and they would not try to recapture Port Royal again. The territorial dispute would not be fully resolved until the British conquest of New France in 1760, and the informal boundary between the British and French in the dispute, the Mississauga River, now forms the border between the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The order of battle. British forces included Colonel Francis Nicholson, and the fleet included the HMS Dragon of 50 guns, HMS Falmouth of 50 guns, HMS Chester of 50 guns, HMS Lowestoft of 32 guns, HMS Feversham of 35 guns, the HMS Star, and the Province Galley under Captain Cyprian Southak. Land forces included Colonel Samuel Vetch as the Adjutant General, Captain Walter Elliott, Brigadier Major, a battalion of Marines, Hobby's Regiment from Massachusetts Bay under Colonel Sir Charles Hobby, Taylor's Regiment from Massachusetts Bay under Colonel William Taylor, Whiting's Regiment from Connecticut under Colonel William Whiting, Walton's Regiment from New Hampshire under Colonel Shadrach Walton, and a company of gunner and matroses under Colonel Samuel Vetch, captain, and company of Indian Scouts, Iroquois Indians, under Major of Scouts John Livingston, captain. The French forces included Captain Daniel d'Alger de Subercase, who was the governor of Acadia, 150 soldiers of the Compagnie Française de la Marine, and 100 men of the Acadian militia, and some Quebecois, which are called Canadians, and some privateers, pirates. Port Royal was the capital of the French colony of Acadia, almost since France first began settling the area in 1604. It consequently became a focal point for conflict between English and French colonists in the next century. It was destroyed in 1613 by English raiders led by Samuel Argall, but eventually rebuilt. In 1690, it was captured by forces from the province of Massachusetts Bay, although it was restored to France by the Treaty of Ryswick. French preparations. With the outbreak of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1702, English and French colonists once again prepared for conflict. Acadia's governor, Jacques-François de Montebellon de Boulin, had, in anticipation of war, already begun construction of a stone and earth fort in 1701, which was largely completed by 1704. Following a French raid on Deerfield on the Massachusetts frontier in February 1704, English colonists in Boston organized a raid against Acadia the following May, led by Benjamin Church. They raided Grand Pre and other Acadian communities. English and French accounts differ on whether Church's expedition mounted an attack on Port Royal. Church's account indicates that they anchored in the harbor and considered making an attack, but ultimately decided against the idea, and French accounts claim that a minor attack was made. When Daniel d'Alger de Subercase became governor of Acadia in 1706, he went on the offensive, encouraging Indian raids against the English New England colonies. He also encouraged privateering from Port Royal against English colonial shipping. The privateers were highly effective. Okay, and this has been covered before, the New England preparations. Okay, now looking on to Massachusetts. Massachusetts raised nearly 1,000 men. New Hampshire provided 60 men. Rhode Island sent 80, and a company of Indians from Cape Cod was also recruited. These men formed into two provincial infantry regiments. The first regiment consisted of 12 companies in red coats, led by Colonel Francis Wainwright, while the second regiment consisted of 11 companies in blue coats under the command of Colonel Winthrop Hilton. Recruiting was difficult in Massachusetts due to the lack of enthusiasm for the endeavor, and authorities were forced to draft men to fill the ranks. The authorities in Connecticut were also asked to contribute to the expedition, but declined, citing bad feeling over the return of Port Royal by treaty after its capture in 1690. The force, which was placed under the command of Colonel John March, totaled 1,150 soldiers and 450 sailors, and was carried by a fleet of 24 ships, including the 50-gun Royal Navy warship Deptford, under the command of Captain Charles Stuckley, and the 24-gun New England ketch Province Galley. And March took a former prisoner of the Maliseet as his translator. The first siege we already talked about, and It failed, and the second siege also failed in 1707, even though the New Englanders had overwhelming numerical advantage, which meant when they returned to New England, the commanders were ridiculed. The interlude. From Casco Bay, March sent a letter to Boston in which he laid the blame for the expedition's failure on Stuckley and Redknapp. News of the failure preceded his messengers, and they were met upon their arrival by a jeering crowd of men and women. Losers. Redknapp, one of his messengers, were able to convince Dudley that he had acted within his orders, and blame was generally attached to March for the failure. Dudley issued orders to March that the fleet should stay put, with all men remaining aboard under penalty of death, while his council considered the next step. Dudley eventually sent reinforcements and a 3-man commission, including 2 colonels and John Leverett, a lawyer with no military experience, to oversee affairs, and ordered the expedition to make a second attack. Despite the orders, desertion from the British fleet was high, and the force was reduced to about 850 when it sailed for Port Royal in late August. March resigned the expedition command and was replaced by Wainwright. Subercase was forewarned of the second attempt and had erected additional defenses to impede the attackers' approaches. He was also reinforced by the fortuitous arrival of the Intrépide, a French frigate under the command of Pierre Maupain. His crew was added to the defenses, and captured prize ships he brought with him provided needed provisions for the fort. More information about the second siege in 1707. The British fleet arrived near Port Royal on August 21st, and Wainwright landed his troops about 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers south of the fort. And the next day, he marched them to a position about 1 mile, or 1.6 kilometers, north of the fort. This area where March had previously camped was one of the areas near which Subercase had thrown up additional defensive earthworks. On August 23rd, Wainwright sent a detachment of 300 to clear a path for the heavy cannon. This attempt was repulsed by forces sent out by Subercase to harass them. Using guerrilla-style tactics and fire from the fort's cannons, they forced the New Englanders to retreat to their camp. This defeat apparently had a significant effect on the invaders' morale. Wainwright wrote that his camp was surrounded with enemies and judging it unsafe to proceed on any service without a company of at least 100 men. And was probably the most serious clash. A foraging party cutting brush was ambushed by a French and Indian force, and 9 of its members were killed. The situation got so bad in the British camp that on the 27th, they withdrew to another camp protected by their ship's guns. The camp was not properly fortified, and soldiers there were constantly subjected to sniping and other attacks from French forces and their Indian allies. When Wainwright made a second landing at another point on August 31st, Subercase himself led 120 soldiers out of the fort. About 70 men engaged the New Englanders in hand-to-hand combat, which was fought with axes and musket butts. St. Castin and almost 20 of his men were wounded, while 5 others were killed. The next day, September 1st, the British re-embarked on their ships and sailed back to Boston. The French, in the reports, claimed to have killed as many as 200 men, but British sources claim only about 16 killed and 16 wounded in the siege. The aftermath. The expedition's return to Boston was also met with jeers. Dudley's commissioners were sarcastically called the 3 Port Royal worthies and the 3 champions, very sarcastic. Dudley's reports of the affair minimized its failings, pointing out that many plantations around Port Royal had been destroyed during the two sieges. Dudley also refused to make inquiries into the expedition's failure, fearing the blame would be placed on him. Subercase, concerned that the British might return the following year, worked to strengthen the fortifications at Port Royal. He also built a small warship to assist in the colony's defenses, and convinced Maupain to raid New England shipping. The privateer was so successful that by the end of 1708, Port Royal was overcrowded with prisoners from the captured prizes. None of this helped save Port Royal from the next attack. Since France failed to send any significant support, while the British mobilized larger and better organized forces. Vetch, with support from Dudley, Boston merchants, and the New England fishing community, successfully lobbied Queen Anne for military support for an expedition to conquer all of New France in 1709. This prompted the colonists to mobilize in the expectation that troops would arrive from England. Their efforts were aborted when the promised military support failed to materialize. Vetch and Francis Nicholson returned to England in its aftermath and again secured promises of military support for an attempt on Port Royal in 1710. In the summer of 1710, a fleet arrived in Boston carrying 400 Marines. Augmented by colonial regiments, this force captured Port Royal after a third siege in 1710. Nova Scotia Regiment. The 40th Regiment of Foot. Soldiers who looked like this at the time. The 40th Regiment of Foot was the first British regiment to be raised in Nova Scotia and was commanded directly by 4 consecutive governors of Nova Scotia over 42 years. The regiment was raised by General Richard Phillips in August 1717 out of independent companies stationed in North America and the West Indies. The regiment was first known as Phillips Regiment, 1717 to 1749, Cornwallis's Regiment, 1749 to 1752, and in 1751, the regiment was numbered the 40th Regiment of Foot and became known as 40th Hobson's Regiment, 1752 to 1759. The 40th fought in Father Rail's War, King George's War, Father Le Doutre's War, and then the 7 Years' War.